Welcome everybody once again to this very special edition of Right on the Nail. Well, we are now in August when really very little happens. Everybody goes away on holiday and the world comes to a standstill, except, of course, it hasn't and it's not. And there's lots of important things going on. We have a new Prime Minister. He's only been there for 2 weeks, but my word, it feels like he's been there for 2 months already, or could even be 2 years. And there's lots going on. I believe Andy Burnham is actually going on holiday this week, which is fine with me. Everybody deserves a holiday. It's going to make him much better and much more refreshed when he comes back. That's what we all need. But Nigel Farage can't have a holiday because he's got a by-election to fight against Count Binface. So he's going to be pretty busy, and he's pretty busy defending himself against all kinds of allegations of financial impropriety on the people that have been backing him. So there's a lot going on to talk about. So we're going to get right into it straight away with three wonderful guests, writer, broadcaster and columnist Christina Patterson. It's lovely to have Christina on the show. It always is. We also are joined by managing editor and deputy editorial director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Daniel Freeman, and from the Labour National Executive Committee, Jess Barnard. Lovely to see you all, and welcome to the show, all three of you. Let's start with Andy Burnham. Now, as I say, he has only been in situ for exactly 2 weeks, but it does feel like he's achieved quite a lot in a very short space of time. He's also seen a turnaround in the polling fortunes, with Labour Party now almost ahead of Reform after such a small time. Jess, how is Andy Burnham doing? Is he pretty secure in his position now in the party as a whole? Is there going to be any ongoing issues with the left wing of the party when the budget is announced in the autumn, which could well be not what everybody is hoping for? Whereabouts is he sitting in terms of the party in general?
Great questions, Chris. I think so far, broad consensus is that he has settled in well into post. I think most of us can agree. I think Keir Starmer was not a sort of natural PM, and it felt like at many times he wasn't particularly comfortable. He wasn't comfortable announcing policies. He wasn't comfortable with the membership. And, it was, to be honest, even if you didn't, even if you supported him politically, it made it quite a difficult thing to watch. Whereas Andy Burnham, he's much more natural. He's obviously very comfortable. He sees himself as a prime minister, and that does a lot of the heavy lifting, to be honest. But obviously what we want to see is the real policies and changes that will see more money in people's pockets, easing the cost of living crisis and addressing the big issues that people want to see addressed. Now, in terms of where the party's at, I think there's a lot of frustration over the past few years where members have been really sidelined, and that has been reflected on in the sort of the local structures of the party. So there haven't really been the kind of door knockers out. There hasn't been the sort of membership activity, which is so important to the Labour Party, which is very much, powered by the people. So without that, it's really, really suffered. But the mood has changed significantly. People are very willing to give Andy the space to turn things around. And so I think he is being given quite a lot of grace in that sense. But aside from that, obviously, we have seen some really promising first month of announcements that people really welcome. His interventions on ending rough sleeping, I think that's something that's extremely important and popular with pretty much every demographic of Labour supporter or previous Labour supporter. His commitment to addressing the social care crisis, I think people are very pleased to see, but also the policies that will see immediately easing financial pressures on families, like the bus caps of £2. I think obviously there's definitely more to come, and as someone on the National Executive Committee, I've seen a lot of pretty toxic factionalism, which has prevented us from participating in the party. I haven't seen huge changes on that yet. I'm really hoping to see that. I hope there is a change in attitude where we can become a pluralist party again. But I think he has a long way to go before we're there.
It's amazing how it does seem like he's been in situ for months, not 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's a sign. I think it's a sign of, someone who really has an idea of what he wants to achieve. And I think that was definitely missing with Starmer. It felt like he was reacting to things a lot of the time. Whereas Andy Burnham has come in and he's set the scene for the things that he cares about. And obviously at the heart of those are things like job creation, protecting kind of British industries or reindustrialization, as he's calling it, which is a interesting proposal for a lot of communities who feel left behind. Also devolution, right? Devolution is his really big passion, and sort of thinking about how he can redistribute power across different parts of the country. So he has clearly come in with a program, and that means that things are moving a lot faster than they have been for a number of years.
Yeah, lots of good gestures, like the bus fares is a good gesture. The business rates on pubs and live music venues is a good gesture. Not incredibly expensive. More, I wouldn't say a gimmick. I think it's a good thing to address some of these issues. Obviously, it would always be better if there were more money in people's pockets, a bigger reduction in rates for pubs and clubs and so forth. But Daniel, there's lots of, I wouldn't say wild promises. I don't think we're getting that vibe, but there are lots of promises of moving in a certain direction. But where is the money going to come from?
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting seeing Jess's analysis, because in some ways it's quite similar to what I asked a friend of mine who's a Labour Party activist what he thought about Andy Burnham when he first came into Downing Street. And his analysis was it's Starmerism with a human face. And I think for better and worse, this is true. So exactly as you point out, the actual policies he's announced so far are fairly minor in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the amount of money that is being spent on them. So reducing business rates on pubs and live venues, also the VAT reduction on electricity for 1 year. These are things that are currently being paid for. Well, the electricity reduction, the reduction in VAT on electricity is supposed to be paid for out of scrapping the digital ID plan, which was initially a Starmer idea, was very popular before it was a Starmer idea, and then immediately became very unpopular as soon as Keir Starmer announced it. But the fundamentals of the economic and fiscal situation we're facing are not changed at all. You still have the current government saying that they are not going to increase any of the three big taxes. So VAT, income tax, and national insurance contributions. But you're also getting a lot of announcements that require significant amounts of public money behind it. So, for example, the plan to end rough sleeping. So far, this is purely an aspiration. There is no sort of roadmap to how you achieve it. And it's very difficult to see how you can achieve it without billions of pounds. Again, statements on social care, we've seen aspirations, but no real sense of how you pay for it. And also, let's not forget, you've now got John Healey in number 11, who quit the Starmer administration because of differences over defence spending. So if they are going to commit to 3% of GDP on defence by 2030, that's a load of extra money that you have to find from somewhere. And we're reaching the edge of the economy's ability to sort of sustain just more taxes here and there without anyone noticing. If you do want to pay for this, it means higher taxes on everyone. And that's the point at which it's going to become really, really politically difficult and also really, really economically problematic as well.
Yeah, exactly. Christina, he's had a pretty intense barrage straight away from the right-wing press. The Daily Mail from day one seemed to make sure every front page headline is nothing but what Andy Burnham is doing wrong. And the same applies to some of the other right-wing papers as well. I mean, how does he cope with all of this? I mean, there's going to be one section of society in the country that are already thinking, oh my God, he's even worse than Keir Starmer, just because that's what they read on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I mean, luckily, from that point of view, from those of us, I've written a lot for the right-wing press because it's basically the press. If you want to write anything, it's the only option.
Exactly. You can't avoid it.
Luckily, stroke unluckily, for those of us who are journalists, those audiences are shrinking a great deal. And I who have not been very hopeful for a long time, see quite a few rays of hope. And one of those is that at least the right-wing press have also started attacking Farage, which they absolutely didn't for a long time. He had a total free pass, even with the Times and Sunday Times. And the Guardian, the Times, the Sunday Times, even the Mail have started criticising him. And the fact that he is under, or will again be under investigation on the 5 million donation by Christopher Harbon, depending on what happens in Clapton, means that he's rarely out of the headlights in relation to money. And that is having an effect. His personal ratings are dropping. But in terms of Burnham, for me, I feel like, and I'm sure many people in the kind of centre of politics probably feel something similar, is that I feel I can almost relax a bit for a tiny period, simply because I feel we're in the hands of a professional. And this guy knows how to handle this stuff. Now, I personally find his manner slightly irritating. It's not fair. It goes down very well with lots of people. His social media goes down very well with lots of people. Great. I'm all for anything that gives power, attention and votes to a centrist government, whether that be centre-left or even, if necessary, centre-right, anything that keeps Reform and Restore and indeed the Greens out of power. Not that the Greens have a hope in hell of coming to power, thank God. But I think he's very, very good on tone. And he's been studying this stuff for a long time. He's a professional politician in the way that poor Keir Starmer never, ever was and never, ever could be. And he does seem comfortable in his own skin. And I think none of his policies so far will change the world. Although if he solves social care, that absolutely will have an enormous effect on the country, on the NHS, on all kinds of things. Because one of the reasons the NHS is semi-collapsing is because there is no proper provision for older people. And because people get, within a week or two of a hospital visit, unless they get properly monitored and looked after at a local level, they end up unable to walk, unable to go to the loo on their own, and they end up in care homes and the whole system kind of semi-collapses. And they also, not their fault, hog hospital beds that could go to other people. But I think he's been very, very careful in drip feeding policies that will appeal to different parts of the electorate. So the bus fare thing, great, that gives people the impression they're going to have a bit more money in their pocket and it appeals to a particular demographic. VAT on electricity bills appeals to everyone.
Yeah.
Social care appeals mostly to middle-aged and older people, perhaps Gen X and certainly boomers, but also the youngsters who are thinking about their parents. Although nobody wants to pay for it, I think anybody who has known anyone who faces the agony of dementia, which is a lot of people, realize that the system is an absolute nightmare. And I think one of the main differences we're noticing in Andy Burnham is that Andy Burnham has picked an issue he is absolutely passionate about because he has watched his father get Alzheimer's. It's probably incredibly painful for him that his father doesn't even know he's prime minister. Imagine your father being alive. You're dying to tell him you're in number 10 and he doesn't know. He knows what a nightmare this system is. He's passionate about it. I was doing a lot of work in terms of campaigning about the NHS, poor standards in the NHS and poor standards in nursing when Andy Burnham was health secretary. So he does know how the system works. He understands the complexities of it. And he's not going to say, I'm going to sort this out in 5 minutes, because this isn't something you can sort out in 5 minutes. But the fact that he's asking for inter-party cooperation, the fact that he is willing to grapple with an issue that everybody else has found too hard to handle, I think speaks very much in his favour. So I think we're in the hands of a consummate professional. Of course, his popularity probably highest now than it will ever be. It will go down. But I think he knows what he's doing. And for me, that's a huge relief.
Yeah, I agree. I sense exactly the same. But Jess, coming back to you, I mean, we all know in managing the household budget, there's only three things you can do. You either make more money, which means increasing taxation, or you spend a little bit less, or you borrow some more money. And borrowing money is going to be difficult. So you're left with the two other options. But the option we can't avoid is the fact that the books have to be balanced to some extent. And there is a little bit of a vibe out there that there will be some cost cutting in the budget. Now, if there is cost cutting, how's that going to go down with the rank and file left wing of the party membership and the MPs in Westminster? Is there like a big problem waiting around the corner?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think this is something that is quite interesting when you look at different issues specifically across the party, right? And obviously with social care, for example, Andy Burnham understands the cost of not addressing that crisis, right? There is an ongoing cost on families whose parents get sick or get dementia, need that care, but also on the NHS. And so there is a cost on society for not addressing that problem. And the same can be said across many, many other areas. So on housing, for example, right, the fact that the government are subsidising to the tune of tens of billions of pounds private landlords because of the housing crisis, if that isn't addressed, that's a constant drain on the government. So I think that there will be a push from the Labour membership to get Andy Burnham to think about how that wealth is distributed in society, who owns the assets, and how we can think long term. And that in some cases will require investment. So, there is a call for investment to build council housing, to build social housing, to address the immediate cost of housing crisis, but in many other areas as well, like renationalising services. So I think those are the conversations that are happening. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about a wealth tax. I support a wealth tax. Lots of people across the Labour movement will be calling for that wealth tax, and a lot of MPs have signed to call for their support, to ask those with the most in society to carry more of the burden, but also to start to look at how we slow down the process of wealth being funneled into the hands of a very, very few people, which is the current state of affairs. So there are huge questions for Andy Burnham on how he responds to that. Obviously, he will face a lot of pressure from the right, from various lobbyists and from the most wealthy in society not to do that. But if we want to think about how we can make sure we can pay for these things going forwards, but also provide a better standard of living and make sure that we have the infrastructure we need that is, owned by the government, then these are things that he needs to start thinking about.
But a lot of these things are not solved very quickly, and they're quite complex, and it really takes, not a few months, maybe not even a few years to put them in place in a way that they're going to work. And it has to be thought through quite carefully too.
Absolutely. And this is it, right? We need to have people willing to think about, rather than saying, that's not going to work because of this, we need to be thinking about how can we make this work? How can we overcome these issues? And it does seem like he's willing to kind of explore some of those things. I mean, something that obviously he's been talking about is allocating some of the budgets to mayors in cities to support with kind of planning and development. I think that's an interesting policy. Maybe that's something a bit of we'll see how it goes. I definitely think there are still more questions around that for areas that don't have mayors, like towns where I'm from. There are questions around how we continue to redistribute wealth beyond cities. But it seems like, he may respond to new ideas and overcoming some of those problems.
Would I be able to just come in on social care? Because
sure, come on. Yes,
I think one of the interesting things about one of the main proposals that's been floated by the Burnham administration is you might have a 2% increase on income tax to basically provide free social care to everyone. That is actually something that would significantly skew the tax system and the welfare system towards those who have assets. Because under the current system, you get social care no matter what, but if you are someone who has a lot of assets, you have to pay for it until those assets are exhausted. So the main beneficiaries actually out of an NHS for social care would be people who are asset rich, basically. It would be and people who are going to inherit assets. So that is a kind of interesting contradiction, I think, between sort of the idea that, we're trying to, help working people, but also tax them more in order to protect the assets of mostly middle-class people. I'm not saying necessarily you have to oppose it on that grounds. I'm just saying there is like a tension here.
But sorry, Daniel, my understanding is that they haven't, all kinds of things have been floated, but they haven't said at this point how they would tax it. Other people have talked about his 10% so-called death tax, from which he mentioned 16 years ago. There are all kinds of options. And personally, I think let's wait and see in terms of proposals on the funding front. Either way, there are going to be winners and losers. But I think part of the issue at the moment, particularly in relation to the Daily Mail and the right-wing press, is what happens to aspiration, those people who have saved all their life, who have gotten the housing ladder, whose assets are in a house that might be worth 300 or 400 grand, and then lose it all in a couple of years in terms of dementia care or whatever. That doesn't seem very fair either. Now, I mean, of course, there are winners and losers for every policy. And I personally, everyone talks about a wealth tax, or everyone on the left talks about a wealth tax as if it's the answer to everything. If you have a house in London, for example, they've talked about 5 million being the threshold at which you start paying a percentage of the value of your house. I sold my flat that I'd had. I never even dreamt of living in a house in London. I sold the flat that I'd lived in for 25 years, 3 years ago, joined forces with my husband, who also had similar amounts. We managed to scrape together to buy a house that's 1.5 million, ridiculous on my income, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. Paid 90 grand in stamp duty. Both don't have high incomes. You know, the very thought that having done that, we would now, the stamp duty would be abolished and we would have to pay a percentage of the value of our home is absolutely crazy. So a wealth tax sounds great if you haven't got a hope in hell of being perceived as wealthy. But a lot of people in the Southeast, well, who are not very high income, who've made very careful choices about what to invest in, you know, would not deem themselves to be rich, would not have a high income. And it's all very well for people outside London to say wealth tax, wealth tax, wealth tax. But I think you have to tread very carefully on these things.
Well, like I say, it's all these ideas take a lot of refining to come up with exactly what's going to work. And we talk about also increased mansion tax, like a super mansion tax. Okay, and a lot of people's wealth is tied up in their house. In your case, Christina, you know roughly what your house is worth because you bought it, or your flat.
Less than we bought it for 3 years ago.
Okay, that's probably true as well. But you bought it relatively recently. A lot of people have got houses that they bought a long time ago. How do you value those houses? I mean, and then...
This is one of the huge problems with wealth taxes, and it's why most countries in Europe that had them 30 or 35 years ago got rid of them. It's because they're administratively really, really difficult to get right.
I mean, great idea, but it's so difficult to make it work. You talk also about taxing the very wealthy people, and there are wealthy people, there are people that are very wealthy, and there are the super wealthy people. And I think that it's amazing that we're having so many problems in the world in general, but there are so many people, and Elon Musk might be just the tip of or Jeff Bezos, the tip of an iceberg. But as much as we'd like to think that these people should be contributing more, they are able to set themselves up in a way that they can contribute absolutely nothing. So when you're going after wealthy people, you're going after people like Christina's wealthy because she and her husband own a £1.5 million flat in London or something along those lines. But okay, so to some people you are wealthy, Christina, but in the real world, there are people that are worth trillions and trillions and trillions, and they should be contributing more. So how do you get hold of them to make
having that conversation, right, about how do we make sure that the mostly wealthy, the 1% in society, are not only paying more taxes, right, but that we are taking steps to make sure we're slowing down the transfer of wealth that is created by workers in this country into their pockets. And that's what's currently happening. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that rather than us saying, well, no, this won't work, well, what will work, right? Like, we should be exploring what are the solutions to that issue. And I will just quickly say, like, there are different proposals of models of the wealth tax and how it would be rolled out, how you would navigate the administration of that. I haven't heard that it's for people who own, you know, who have a wealth of 1.5 million. Most commonly talked about is sort of 10 million plus, but there are different models. And I think it's important to think about how we can think about what is possible and how we can navigate that, rather than immediately saying, well, this won't work because of this, without coming with any solutions. Because we do need to find a way to address growing inequality in this country.
Daniel?
I think we're getting to the end of the viability of the idea that we can always get more taxation by taxing other people. There are lots and lots of problems with wealth taxes. There are very good reasons why most developed countries abandoned them. And also the problem is, if you're saying you're trying to raise revenue from a narrower and narrower group of people, these people, if you're hitting them more, they are more likely and inclined to leave the country, especially if you're trying to apply it.
Because most of their wealth is in things that exist in this country physically. It's in assets, it's in land, it's in services. So what does that mean?
Wait, no, if you change your tax residency, like if I go and move and live in France, I pay French taxes if I'm a tax resident there. it doesn't matter if I'm getting an income stream from Britain. That is French taxes, so I get taxed in France.
But that's why this has got to be part of us thinking about a series of steps that we can take, right? There are other things we can do. And I hear this argument a lot about, we can't tax wealthy people because then they'll leave. Okay, well, fine. If we take that as as a serious risk that we want to consider, then what are the steps that we can take to disincentivize that? Can we introduce an exit tax? Can we introduce higher taxes on foreign investors?
That's bad.
These are
you
things
really don't want to do that.
Perhaps you feel that way, but there are other steps that we can take to disincentivize that we should be talking about, rather than just saying, well, we can't possibly tax the most wealthy billionaires in the country who are extracting wealth from all the people
but
who are
we already do.
Country.
This is not billionaires, the top 1% of earners.
Year on year, while things get harder for working people in this country.
Right.
And I think we have to have a conversation about how
things
we address
could be better. But you do that through economic growth.
And stop wealth being centralized into the hands of very few people. It's exploitative and it shouldn't continue. And I think most working people in this country feel the same. They want to see.
The top 1% of earners pay 30% of all income tax already. The top 10% of earners pay 60% of all income tax. We do have a very progressive tax system. Like, you can say it should be more so.
Absolutely, that is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
Let me say something, because you talk about how can you tax people instead of them leaving the country. I believe in America, and I think it was probably called the Elizabeth Taylor Amendment or something strange like that, that they did bring in a law in America that you do pay American tax unless you renounce your US citizenship. And then you still pay American tax for, I think, 7 years or something like that. So you can bring in something of that nature. Now, people might say, okay, I don't care about renouncing my citizenship. You still pay tax for a while. You don't need to give gongs and peerages and knighthoods to people that decide that they're not going to pay their tax and leave the country, and instead go and use the money that they've saved by donating it to a political party from outside of the country that's going to give you a gong or something. There's little things that you can do that might make it just like, okay, if we live in England, we belong to a club. And if you belong to a club, you pay your membership subscription. And you don't always have the club doing what you want it to do, but you still pay your subscription. There is a benefit to living in England. It's a nice place to live, or the United Kingdom, I should say. So, we don't have to just say, no, we can't do this, but try and make it work in a way where everybody feels that they are part of the process. And the other thing is, if people, and this is another issue, people are much more prepared to pay their membership subscription if they feel that their subscriptions are being spent on all the right things. But if they feel their membership subscription is being spent on the wrong things, and they still can't get something good to eat or drink and at the bar at the club or something like that, and then they think, why am I paying this subscription? So
absolutely
that
right.
has to be addressed as well. And there is an issue that, with the perception of a lot of people, is that I don't mind what I'm paying, but I don't think that it's being spent in the right way. And people can always disagree on that, but there is an element of how the whole social care system does work that it could work better.
Couldn't agree more. In terms of having done a lot of investigating into the NHS and seeing the people who don't turn up for appointments. I mean, obviously you don't see them because you're not there, but seeing the number of people who don't turn up to appointments and things like that, there's enormous wastage in the system. And when I think of the stamp duty we spent, which may be abolished, I wouldn't resent a penny of that if I felt it was being properly spent. But I see massive waste in the public sector, massive waste. And I'm on the centre left. So, no wonder the Daily Mail are railing against some of these things, because there's a lot of inefficiency.
Let's move on and talk about Nigel Farage. Is he in trouble? Christina, you were talking about this earlier. Is he in trouble? Is he now no longer an asset to his party? And does his party exist without him if he were to be booted out, or even lose his by-election against Count Binface and the Rejoin EU party in Clapton?
Well, as I said, I'm feeling hopeful for the first time for a very long time on that front, because Farage seemed to have this sense of impermeability. Nobody could touch him, and his shtick is completely lost on me. I find it repellent. But clearly, a lot of people think man of the people, man in the pub with a pint. great, he doesn't like all these foreigners coming in on boats, nor do I. Let's just, get rid of them all. I think the luster has definitely come off his machine. I think the pile up of financial scandals, George Cottrell's mother, all these Christopher Harborne, it's kind of relentless, really. And if he were genuinely unrattled by it, he would have had a very different demeanor over the past few weeks. But he's come across as petulant, sulky, angry, short-tempered. I know someone who works at GB News, and he drinks a lot. I very much doubt he actually wants to be Prime Minister. Actually, I think he'd like to get the job and then sail off into the sunset, because I think it's a very difficult job. As we know, all political careers end in failure, essentially. Keir Starmer, in my view, was a decent man who unfortunately didn't have, in the end, the right combination of skills. I think Andy Burnham has a better chance, but everybody fails at it ultimately. And I think Farage doesn't have a fraction of the skills necessary. He's a very good communicator and a very good campaigner. He's not at all interested in the nuts and bolts of how you actually make policies work. And I think the public are starting to see that. Though there are Farage diehards, and there are people in lots of pockets of the country who will always go for, or will currently, until they've tried it out, go for the insurgent party that seems to be wanting to stick it to the establishment. Once you've tried that, once you've seen what happens when the stick it to the establishment party takes over, you might be a lot less keen. And I think we've seen that with Brexit. Everybody thought that those who voted for Brexit thought Brexit would be the answer to everything. And then they don't like EESQs when they go on holiday. Well, make your mind up. As you say about the club, if you're in the club, you get the benefits of the club. If you leave the club, you don't. That's just the deal. And by the way, on Ceuta, which we touched on earlier, people who go to Ceuta can't automatically get into the EU. That's a misconception. You still have to there are border checks into Spain. So all these people saying we're introducing Schengen checks, it's wrong. They wouldn't be able to get in anywhere.
Okay, let's come back to Ceuta in a minute. Let's stick with Farage and Reform. Jess, is Reform no longer as big a threat to Labour at the polling booth? And what would be the impact of Farage no longer being the leader of Reform?
It's a good question. I think, well, first of all, on Farage, he's just an incredible fraudster, isn't he? He's so good at pretending he's a man of the people, and it's really like chimed with a lot of people, but he's not. He's an extremely wealthy man. He's very detached from a lot of the people that he's trying to speak to. Their struggles are not things that he will ever experience or has ever experienced. And yeah, it's pretty hypocritical from him, but he does seem to have kind of 9 lives, and we do see him sort of vanish a bit and then come back, and kind of, there's this rehabilitation of his image that goes on. I do think we've seen the sort of cracks starting to show. That said, I think that Reform are not going away. Obviously, we saw in the mayoral election in Manchester, they still got a high proportion of the vote, and there's still efforts to kind of divide our communities and create a situation where people are blaming migrants for the issues that they face. So I don't think we should be kind of getting complacent about it. And the pressure really is on Andy Burnham to, again, as I said, try and address those material problems that create that resentment in people's daily lives. And I think the cost of living crisis has got to be at the heart of that. What I will say, though, is I do think, Nigel Farage has really not helped himself by kind of creating this like facade election thing to obscure his sort of financial misconduct. So, we'll see how that plays out for him.
May I just say one thing before you go on to Daniel in relation to the cost of living thing? There was a very interesting report, and I need to read it, and I'm afraid I can't even remember who produced it now, but it was about spending under the Boris Levelling Up programme, where there was a lot of sort of pork barrel politics going on. But there was one area, and I may have got this wrong, I think it might have been Hartlepool, but I'm not sure, where there was massive expenditure, visible change to the town centre, changes in employment, visible increase in opportunities, and in spite of the very visible improvement to everyone, people still supported reform. So I'm afraid I don't think there is an equation between improvement in people's living standards and diminished support for reform. People aren't rational in that way. I think what Burnham needs to do is to be seen to be visibly gripping the small boats thing, which he's trying to do at the moment, and making a visible difference on immigration and telling that story, because Labour has massively reduced immigration after the Boris wave of 1.4 million came in. And I think perception is all here. It's not really about the reality, it's about the perception.
Now, the perception, Daniel, could be that Andy Burnham is coming from, he's not part of the establishment. He came from Manchester. He speaks in a different voice, with a different language to everybody else. And all of these people that voted for Brexit and vote for reform thinking, my world is crap. It's the fault of Labour. It's the fault of the Conservatives. They're the ones what's made it as bad as it is. So I'm voting for this outsider, Farage. But is Andy Burnham able to say, no, I'm the outsider too, and you can vote for me and I'll fix it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a bit tricky to convince people that he's entirely an outsider, having been to Cambridge basically his entire career in politics and having been a cabinet minister before he was 40 in the New Labour period. But I also think the idea of someone being an outsider is actually in many ways overrated, especially from a kind of class perspective. You sometimes get people sort of criticizing Farage, saying, oh, he's not a real outsider. He's not a real man of the people because he went to an expensive school. I just really don't think there's any evidence that the public care about that on the whole. People who do care about that tend to always vote Labour or maybe always vote Green. I think what will be more significant is if he can actually signal there is going to be a significant policy break from the Keir Starmer administration. So far, we've seen this in terms of a few aspirations, but I think the real key testing point will be this autumn's budget to see, okay, are these aspirations real? Do they really want to spend significantly more than we're already spending in the public sector? And if so, how are you going to pay for that? Because realistically, that does mean all of us, including people who consider themselves very ordinary, are going to be paying more in taxes. And that will be a difficult sell.
Christina?
Yeah, I don't think, I personally, I couldn't care less whether people are outsiders, but I could care less whether people are pretending to be outsiders. I find that extremely, it's just kind of irrelevant, really. I think it's all about, it's very difficult. I think it's about addressing the issues that people claim to care about. One of those, clearly cost of living is one of those, but in relation to what I said earlier, I think that is very much about perception as well. Clearly, a lot of people are struggling enormously. There's no question of that. I also think a very, very big aspect of this is dying high streets, the rise of vape shops, the sense that people are living in places that have gone to seed, really. And some of that is a result of the Thatcher years and industries having died, but also the high street is dying everywhere. I'm in Italy at the moment. Even here, the local towns, well, not even here, particularly in southern Europe and in France, local towns, the number of shops in town centres has hugely, has disappeared. It's all gone to out of town retail, etc. So I think there are some visible issues that make a difference, but I don't think the issue is whether people perceive that you went to public school or not. Boris Johnson was perceived to have the common touch, and he was an Etonian. It's much more about your ability to communicate than anything else. And I do think that one of Andy Burnham's great advantages is that he is perceived to be a good communicator across the board, both with, centrist dads and with Mancunians and with the youngsters, watching TikTok or whatever. As I say, it wears a bit thin with me, but whatever works in my view.
Yeah. But Jess, in view of what's happening, what's the chances of a snap election?
One of the views of the Labour Party is that we should always be as election ready as possible. But I don't believe that a snap election is on the cards. I think that the consensus is that all of the MPs of Labour Party want to give Andy Burnham the chance to demonstrate what his political kind of programme is about, give him the chance to turn things around. I would also say I'm not sure that there is the huge public appetite for it. I think there's obviously been some pressure from the Reform camp to call one, but otherwise there isn't this kind of drastic call for it. I think people want to see what Andy Burnham can deliver and give him the chance to do that.
And what about immigration now being back on the front page again with the situation in Ceuta? It shows how this is like the story that's never going to go away. And it's okay. The government can claim that the small boat crossings are down overall, but in the last week or two, probably obviously, in part because of the really, really calm, sunny weather that makes it easier to cross the channel. This is the issue that is never, ever going to go away. What should the government be doing about it that they're not doing? And how viable is it? We see today in the press that Rupert Lowe has said one of his rules for rejoining Nigel Farage and Reform is that all people will be sent back. And Reform is saying that the boats will now, the Navy will be sending all of the small boats back to France. Rupert Lowe saying all immigrants will be told to leave the country, every single one of them. I mean, how much public support is there for this degree of harshness towards these people? And is it ever going to go away?
Oh, it's so difficult, isn't it? It's so difficult. And it's I completely understand why, if you live on the coast and people are arriving in small boats on your shores and you don't feel safe. And we can't deny the fact that some of these, because it is mostly young men, and they do come from cultures which have very different mores to us, and they have different attitudes to women. And there have been, if you have large groups of young unemployed men hanging around, that is not necessarily a good thing for a local area. I understand why people resist that, though I also think they completely fixate on something that is actually, in the scheme of things, quite a small issue. And also that Labour has had, I think they've reduced something like 43% in the last year. They've reduced the number of people arriving on small boats, which is a significant success. And they should have told that story more. And as I said, they've also reduced the number of legal migrants, although that creates problems of its own in relation to social care and the NHS and so on. So with every gain, there is a loss. But I think what Reform are suggesting today is just impossible. You can't just, they've said, oh, well, we'll have an argument with the French if they won't accept people back. Well, you can have an argument as much as you like, but if the French Coast Guards will not take migrants back onto their shores, then what do you do with them? They can't just float out in the ocean. I do ultimately think you need to have systems of deterrent. And that's why one of the reasons I support Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary, because I think she's one of the few people in Labour. I'm not saying I support absolutely everything she's suggesting. I think these are really complex matters. As you know, Chris, I'm half Swedish, and the situation in Sweden has been very, very difficult and has led to, a shift to the right and all support from the far right. And I think the key reason we have to tackle migration, legal and illegal, is because if we don't, what happens everywhere is that there's a resurgence of the far right. So I think we have to do it.
That's it, exactly. And Shabana Mahmood, Jess, she's considered pretty right-wing in terms of the Labour Party as a whole. And Christina's making the case that what she's doing has the support of most people in the country, and I think that's probably true. Is there a battle line being drawn here, or is the party as a whole going to go along with not draconian, but pretty tough measures if they're able to perceive to be successful?
This is a really bleak moment, I think, and a really, really hideous state of affairs, to be honest. And it makes me really shameful. I feel really ashamed to be British at this point, because I just think this isn't the kind of politics that we should be promoting. I think the Reform and Rupert Lowe's proposals are like a slippery slope towards fascism. It's outrageous to be talking about deporting every single migrant. There's also growing white supremacy. And this is having real impacts on communities. We're seeing, increased racist attacks on our streets up and down the country. And I think that it's really irresponsible from them, but also irresponsible from our mainstream media to continue to kind of push this narrative out without challenging it. I think the reality is, like, Keir Starmer focused a lot of his efforts on promoting this message that the Starmer government deported more people than the Tory governments did in the 12 years before, or something along those lines. And they talked about, the lowest numbers of small boat crossings, all that kind of stuff. The thing is, I just think this just feeds into this narrative where the main issue that we need to be focusing on as a country is migration. And that's not to say that I don't understand people kind of raising concerns about things, but actually we should be talking about more of the positives of migration and the fact that, we're kind of celebrating the lowest number of migrants coming to the country, but it's creating a huge crisis in a care service, in the NHS, in agriculture. There are loads of jobs we're struggling to employ people in because of that. And so I think we're heading into a really, really dangerous position. But the other part of this is as well, we're also stepping back from our role on the international stage, right? We're reducing the amount of international aid that we're allocating. We're seeing growing conflicts and wars around the world. And I think the question needs to be, what can we do to to support stability around the world, and what can the Burnham government do to that. But also, break with this horrific trend of every summer we just see this awful attack on migrant people.
Well, I agree, but I mean the press seem to be fixated on it, and it obviously must sell papers. But Daniel, interesting point here that Jess is making, that in talking about immigration, we need a lot of these people in the workforce. We know we need them for things like social care homes and that kind of thing. And yet at the same time, there's such a large percentage of people leaving school, education, university that can't get jobs. How do you balance the fact that we have so many unemployed UK nationals, especially young people, whilst at the same time, we know there is a need for immigrant labour in a lot of sectors of the economy? I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense. How do you square that circle?
Well, one aspect of this is that workers are not perfectly interchangeable. Someone who might be very good in one position may not have the skills to do something else. I mean, on the social care point, specifically that issue, part of the concern there was actually competition within the economy until, 2019, 2020, when the social health and social care visa was introduced. There was basically no route for migrants from outside the EU to come into the UK to work in social care, which meant social care was about 90+% British citizens doing it. Now, one of the problems that social care faced was that supermarkets, for example, and other parts of the retail sector were starting to offer higher wages, which was sucking people out of working in social care. Basically, people are thinking, maybe it's slightly better conditions and also better pay. So one of the appeals of allowing this special form of visa for social care workers from abroad was it would help keep down wages in the social care sector and therefore keep costs down as well. Now, we've discontinued the social care visa route. Now, you have a lot of people who are already in on this route, but that does mean over time, those wage costs, which are a big part of the cost of social care, are going to creep up. There's another concern, which is that currently, if you're on a social care visa, after 5 years, you get indefinite leave to remain. That means that you're able to leave the sector and go to take a job in any other industry you want, effectively, which will be very good for, or wherever, and very good for people shopping in Tesco or supermarkets or whatever. It will probably also drive up wages more in the social care sector and costs. So this is actually part of the justification Shabana Mahmood had for increasing the amount of time you need to be in the UK before you get ILR if you're on a social care visa, because what that does is basically lock those people into the social care sector and basically ensure that you don't get costs being pushed up.
Ultimately, it's clearly much better that people in social care do get paid much better, because it's unbelievably important work, and people shouldn't. It's absolutely disgraceful that people are paid less than supermarket work for some of the most challenging work that anyone can do. But obviously, like everything else, there'd be a painful transition period where somebody has to absorb those costs. And the question is who? And I know that I think Andy Burnham has talked about removing or reducing the private aspect of social care. Personally, I don't care who runs these things as long as they run them well. And I don't think competition is a bad thing if it works to the advantage of the people who are being looked after. All of this has to be worked through. And I do have a lot of faith in Louise Casey, who seems to be the go-to person for every complex problem in this country in the report she writes. But once again, it's tough decisions, isn't it? Do we want to pay more for it, or who will pay more for it? Will it be the taxpayer? Will it be people selling their homes? Who will it be? But ultimately, for me, there's no question but that wages need to go up. And I also think in terms of the 1.1 million young people who are currently parked on benefits for a complex reasons. And one of my friends' child's is, I know the number of diagnoses of ADHD, autism, etc., has gone through the roof. The idea that these people can't work, in my view, is absolutely crazy. Why shouldn't we be training these people for social care? Why shouldn't we be saying this is really rewarding work? You might progress from here to the NHS, you might want to progress into a nursing degree eventually, which is a fantastic career and actually not that badly paid these days, quite well paid in lots of areas. I think we need to be thinking much more long term, and we should be using the people who are here, and for hospitality as well, because as AI starts to bite into the workforce, and we're already hearing about graduates who are really struggling to get work, some people who are just sending off thousands of applications and just being ghosted and not getting interviews. In my observation and experience, any work experience at all is a massive asset, whether that be in a shop, a restaurant, a care home, or whatever. Because if you know you can work, you can work.
And also in agriculture, which is very labor intensive, all kinds of agriculture and all kinds of farming. But the dichotomy here is that people in the right-wing press, for example, the right-wing media are railing against immigration. And yet at the same time, anyone that goes into a hospital will see how the system works. This is a multicultural country, and we are dependent on people from all over the world to provide us with our medical care, whether it is a basic worker in a care home or whether it's a specialist in the top teaching hospitals throughout the country. You see them interviewed on television. They're from all over the world and with names that reflect that from all over the world. So how come people can't seem to marry this up and say, actually, there's got to be a middle ground here which works, and it works that we do accept that we have people from different cultures originally that are now as British as you or I, that are performing a function that is so utterly dependent for all of us to maintain our health and our well-being. And at the same time, English or British people may have to do jobs that they didn't think that they had to do, because those jobs are going to remain. When you talk about hospitality, yes, people waiting at a table in restaurant, that's not going to be taken over by AI in the same way that as picking fruit and potatoes isn't taken over by AI. These are all jobs that people can do. So really, you end up with the job that you're best attuned towards doing, whether that is being a professor at a university or whether it's working in a care home or whether it's being a specialist surgeon in a top hospital. They're all roles that are not dependent on the culture that you came from or your parents came from for you to be able to do them.
There's also a question, though, of the current situation for young people. And I think we often kind of, we look at the jobs that exist kind of in silos. But I'm from a town, Kings Lynn, and around there's a lot of farming area around the town of Kings Lynn, right? But the reality is, if you go to school in Kings Lynn, say you're not going to go to uni, you're not particularly academic, the main kind of things you'll be pushed towards are like defence areas or the army. The army come into school like loads of times. Those are the kind of jobs that are promoted. There isn't kind of conversations about kind of delving into other sectors very much. But then there's also logistical issues, right? If you're a young person from a poor town and you don't live anywhere near, where you don't have any access to getting to those farmlands, how are you going to go about that? If you can't afford to drive, if you haven't got the money to get a car and get a license as soon as you're able to work, how are you going to start working on the land? There are like legitimate issues that young people face to getting into these kinds of work, even if it is just while they're young people or when they're just out of school. So I think one of the other things we're talking about is like how we build the infrastructure to support people to do those jobs. And this also goes hand in hand with the fact that, a lot of migrant workers are exploited. There will be migrant workers who will be asked to, come and live on the land and work on the land, and will receive very little money, but they'll be told, well, you'll get bed and board, and that's most of your payment. And that's quite an exploitative model, because then they can't leave that area. So how do we address all of those issues? And I think we need to stop looking at jobs in kind of particular silos and think about how we support young people to move into that work.
But that's what Brexit was meant to solve, wasn't it? And nobody tried to solve it. Everyone said, we'll get rid of all these EU workers and then the Brits will do the work. Well, they didn't do the work because who knows why they didn't do the work? But, one of the reasons you described, because people live in caravans or dormitories, get paid a pittance, have no life of their own, or in, kind of homes of multiple occupancy with people sharing rooms. You have to address the whole system, and nobody has the will to do that.
I mean, by 2019, we did basically have full employment. The unemployment rate was, I think, a little under 3%, which is about as low as it's ever been. So I just don't think we should be too apocalyptic about Like, the situation now is a bit worse than it was pre-COVID, but you're still on unemployment rates that are under 5%. So, yeah, definitely could be better, but it's not the early 1980s.
No, but Daniel, I think the issue for me anyway, in relation to unemployment, is not the overall percentage. It's the fact that young people are being kind of written off straight away and not getting into the habit of work. And I think that's a tragedy. I had very bad health in my mid-20s, and I had a sister with schizophrenia who wanted nothing more than to work, who tried everything she could, was eventually sacked from the washing up job she did. I know what it's like to be, I don't personally know, I have been disabled, but I haven't had a mental illness that has made it very difficult for me to work. But I also learned when I was young that work is kind of what gets you out of illness very often. And and that people need support for that. They need, a proper infrastructure. They need proper support. I used to be on the board of a charity called Shore Trust, which does a huge amount of work supporting people into employment, but it's complex work and it's expensive work. None of the, cutting benefits. Of course, you need carrot and stick, but it's not as if cutting services is automatically the solution. It very rarely is.
Well, I think if someone like Rupert Lowe had his way and we did forcibly evict from the country an awful lot of the people that have come here over the last, decade or two, how on earth would the country cope? These people are just such a vital part of the whole fabric of our economic and social life.
But also, it's not just an act on the economy, right? Like these are real people with families, and the process of deporting people, removing people from places that they've lived for many, many years is very violent. It's horrific. And I think we all saw the clips of, like the ICE raids in America and the, detention of family members and whole families there. And I just really kind of implore us to think about, what kind of a society we want to be. And do we want to be a society that represents kind of, the best of humanity? And do we want to kind of work together and try and improve the world we live in? Or are we kind of determined to sort of put up barriers, put up borders, and push anyone out who has a different, first language to us? I think it's a really, really scary time.
I think well said, Jess. And I think that's a very good point to end the conversation, because I think we would all go along with the sentiments that you've expressed there. We didn't cover anything internationally because I felt that we were talking about some very viable and vital aspects of British society, and I think it was important. So with those very good words from Jess, I think that sums up a lot of the conversation and that where we want to be as a country. We can be better. We can be better than a lot of people think that we can be, and that's what we should aspire to be. And so I do think that is a very good time to bring the conversation to a close. Let's see what happens with Nigel Farage and his by-election. Jess has ruled out the fact that we're going to have a snap general election in England. I don't think we really want one. So we are where we are, and I think we have somehow or other eventually nailed it. So you've been listening to Right on the Nail with me, Chris Wright. Thank you to Jess Barnard, Daniel Freeman, and Christina Patterson for a wonderful conversation. If you've enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and family, and make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app. The podcast is produced by Tom Platts at soundsapien.com. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time on Right on the Nail.